Sometimes the most heartbreaking secrets hide behind the most faithful smiles. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who need our help the most. Pastor Eli Matthews thought he knew his congregation after 23 years of service. Every Sunday, the Hartwell family sat in their usual spot, David with his firm handshake and 7-year-old Lila in her Sunday dress. But during prayer time that morning, Lila whispered something that changed everything. Dad locked Mom in the basement. Eli didn't know if it was a child's imagination or something darker. At 58, he'd heard many confessions, but nothing like this. The Hartwells seemed like the perfect Christian family. David was generous with his donations. Lila was always well-behaved. But what happens when a pastor decides to follow his gut feeling? What would he find behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church, casting colorful patterns across the worn wooden pews. Pastor Eli Matthews stood at his office window, watching the early parishioners arrive for the 9 a.m. service. At 58, his once dark hair had turned silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter shared and tears shed with his congregation over more than 2 decades. His office reflected a life dedicated to service. Shelves, lined with theological books, their spines cracked from frequent use, and walls adorned with children's artwork from Sunday school classes spanning the years. But it was the framed photograph on his desk that drew his attention most mornings. Himself and Margaret on their wedding day 32 years ago, both young and full of dreams about the life they'd build together, serving God's people. Margaret had been gone 3 years now. The cancer had taken her quickly, but not before teaching him about suffering in ways no seminary textbook ever could. What haunted him wasn't her death itself. That was part of God's mysterious plan. But the signs he'd missed in the months before her diagnosis. The way she'd grown quiet during dinner conversations, how she'd stopped sharing her thoughts about the sermon planning they used to do together. The distance in her eyes that he'd attributed to fatigue from her volunteer work. "I should have seen it," he whispered to her photograph, as he did most mornings. "I should have known you were hurting." The church bell chimed 8:30, pulling him from his reflection. He straightened his tie and gathered his sermon notes. Today's message was about being alert to the needs of others, about seeing beyond the surface to the heart of those around us. The irony wasn't lost on him. Grace Community Church served a town of just over 4,000 souls in rural Ohio. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Where the local diner served as an unofficial town hall, and where Sunday morning attendance was as much about social connection as spiritual nourishment. Eli had arrived here fresh from seminary, young and eager to change the world one sermon at a time. Now, with silver hair and deeper wisdom earned through experience, he understood that sometimes the most profound changes happened in quiet moments between pastor and parishioner, in hospital rooms and around kitchen tables. The congregation began filing in, as they had for decades. Mrs. Henderson, 93 and sharp as ever, took her seat in the front row where she'd sat since 1954. The Johnson family filled their usual pew, 3 generations strong, from toddlers to grandparents. Young couples who'd grown up in this church now brought their own children, continuing the cycle of faith and community that made this place special. And there, in the 3rd row on the left, sat the Hartwell family. David Hartwell was 42, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his generous contributions to the church budget were well known among the board members. He worked in insurance, though his business seemed to fluctuate between modest success and concerning struggles. Still, he never missed a tithe, and his family always appeared well cared for. Sarah Hartwell was 38, quieter than her husband, but with a gentle warmth that made her popular among the women's ministry. She coordinated the annual Christmas pageant, helped with funeral luncheons, and could be counted on to bring homemade casseroles when families faced crisis. Her auburn hair was always perfectly styled, her clothes tasteful and modest, and she had a way of listening that made people feel heard. Then there was Lila, 7 years old, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's determined chin. She was the kind of child who asked thoughtful questions during Sunday school, who carefully colored inside the lines of her Bible story worksheets, and who never forgot to say, please and thank you. Lila was bright, curious, and had a laugh that could fill a room with joy. From the outside, they were everything a church family should be: faithful, involved, generous, and loving. David served as a deacon, helping make important decisions about church finances and programs. Sarah led the women's Bible study on Thursday evenings. Lila was a star pupil in Sunday school, always eager to share what she'd learned at home. But as Eli looked at them this morning, really looked, something felt different. Sarah sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead, rather than engaging with the friends around her as she usually did. David's arm rested across the back of the pew behind his wife and daughter, but there was something possessive about the gesture rather than protective, and Lila, typically so animated and ready with a smile for anyone who caught her eye, seemed unusually subdued. During the opening hymn, How Great Thou Art, Eli noticed that Sarah's voice, usually clear and confident, was barely audible. When the congregation turned to greet one another with handshakes and hugs, David kept a firm grip on both his wife and daughter, controlling their interactions with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, Pastor Eli," David said when the family approached after service, his smile as broad as ever. "Wonderful sermon today about being our brother's keeper. Really spoke to my heart." "Thank you, David. That means a great deal." Eli shook the man's hand, then turned to Sarah. "Sarah, I missed you at the planning meeting for the Harvest Festival last week. Everything all right?" Before Sarah could respond, David answered for her. "She's been under the weather lately. Nothing serious, just needs rest. You know how it is with women. They take on too much and wear themselves down." Sarah nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, just tired. I'll be back to helping soon." Lila tugged on her father's jacket sleeve. "Daddy, can I show Pastor Eli my—" "Not now, sweetheart," David interrupted smoothly. "Pastor Eli is busy talking to all the adults. Maybe next time." "But," Lila persisted, reaching into her small purse, "I drew a picture of our house in Sunday school. Mrs. Patterson said it was very detailed for my age." She held up a drawing done in crayon on white construction paper. It showed a 2-story house with a red roof, green grass, and yellow flowers in the window boxes. But what caught Eli's attention was the detail at the bottom right corner, a small door with heavy black lines around it, and what looked like a figure behind bars in the small basement window. "That's lovely, Lila," Eli said, studying the drawing more carefully. "Tell me about this part here." He pointed to the basement area. David's hand shot out to take the drawing. "Oh, you know how children are with their imagination. She's been reading too many fairy tales about princesses in towers. Come on, family, we should let others have their turn with Pastor Eli." As they walked away, Eli watched Sarah place her hand protectively on Lila's shoulder, a gesture so brief he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. But he had been paying attention, more than he had in months, perhaps years. Chattes. Rest of Sunday passed in its familiar rhythm. Lunch with the Hendersons, who'd invited him over for pot roast every Sunday since Margaret's passing. An afternoon visit to the hospital to pray with Jim Morrison before his surgery the next morning. Evening service with a smaller but dedicated group of congregants who gathered for a more intimate worship experience. But through it all, Eli couldn't shake the image of that drawing, or the look in Sarah's eyes, or the way David had controlled every interaction his family had with others. It reminded him too much of the signs he'd missed with Margaret. The subtle ways someone can be hurting right in front of you while you're too busy or too comfortable to notice. That night, alone, in the parsonage next to the church, Eli sat in his study with Margaret's photograph in his hands. The house felt too quiet, too empty, filled with memories of conversations that would never happen again and questions that would never be answered. "I failed you," he whispered to the photograph. "I was so busy taking care of everyone else that I didn't see you needed taking care of too. I won't make that mistake again." He opened his Bible to Matthew 18:6. "If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." The words seemed to burn on the page as he remembered Lila's small voice during prayer time, the trust in her eyes as she'd whispered her terrible secret. Whether it was imagination or reality, the child had reached out to him for help. And after 23 years of ministry, after losing Margaret because he'd failed to see her pain, he knew he couldn't ignore what might be a cry for help. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes, not for a sermon, but for something much more important. He wrote down everything he'd observed: Sarah's absence from meetings, her quietness during service, David's controlling behavior, and most importantly, Lila's words and her drawing. At the top of the page he wrote, "What if it's true?" Outside, the church bell chimed midnight, marking the beginning of a new week. But for Pastor Eli Matthews, it marked the beginning of something else entirely, a journey that would test his faith, his courage, and his commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The photograph of Margaret seemed to smile at him from the desk, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt her presence not as a source of guilt, but as a source of strength. She would have wanted him to act. She would have demanded it. Tomorrow, he would begin asking the hard questions. Tonight, he would pray for wisdom, for courage, and for the safety of a little girl who had trusted him with words that might change everything. Monday morning arrived grey and overcast, matching Eli's restless mood. He'd slept poorly, waking several times with fragments of dreams that mixed Margaret's face with the image of Lila's basement drawing. By 5:30, he'd given up on sleep entirely and made his way to the church kitchen to start a pot of coffee. Fee. Church directory lay open on his desk when he returned to his office, turned to the page with the Hartwell family's information. Their professional photo smiled back at him. David in a navy suit, Sarah in a soft blue dress, and Lila between them in a white dress with pink flowers. They looked like any family you'd see in a magazine advertisement for life insurance or family vacations. Perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. He traced his finger over Sarah's face in the photograph. When had he last seen her smile like that? Really smile, not the practiced expression she wore during church services. He couldn't remember, and that realization troubled him more than he cared to admit. The phone rang at 7:15, startling him from his thoughts. "Pastor Eli, this is Martha Brennan from the church office." Martha had served as the church secretary for 12 years, a widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory for details. "I'm sorry to call so early, but I wanted to catch you before the day got away from us." "Of course, Martha. What's on your mind?" "Well, it's probably nothing, but I've been looking over the attendance records for our various committees and ministries. Sarah Hartwell hasn't been to Women's Bible Study in 3 weeks. She also missed the last 2 planning meetings for the Harvest Festival, which isn't like her at all. She's usually our most reliable volunteer." Eli felt his pulse quicken. "Did she call in sick or give any explanation?" "That's just it, she didn't. And when I called their house to check on her, David answered and said she was fine, just needed some rest from all her activities. He said she'd be back when she felt better, but he was very firm about not wanting anyone to bother her with visits right now." The word bother hung in the air between them. In a church community where bringing casseroles to the sick and visiting the homebound were sacred traditions, turning away offers of help was almost unheard of. Martha, I want you to pull all the attendance records for any activity Sarah's been involved with over the past 2 months. Can you have that for me by this afternoon? Of course, Pastor. Is everything all right? Eli hesitated. How could he explain the knot of worry growing in his stomach based on a child's whispered words and his own growing suspicions? I'm just trying to be more attentive to our congregation's needs. After Margaret, he stopped himself. I just want to make sure no one falls through the cracks. After hanging up, Eli found himself studying the church directory photo again. This time, he noticed something he'd missed before. While David and Lila were looking directly at the camera, Sarah's gaze was slightly to the side, as if she'd been looking at something or someone just out of frame when the picture was taken. Or perhaps she'd been avoiding eye contact altogether. The morning brought its usual stream of pastoral duties: a counseling session with a young couple preparing for marriage, a visit to the hospital to see Mrs. Patterson, who'd had hip replacement, surgery, and preparations for the evening board meeting. But through it all, Eli found his attention drifting to the Hartwell family. During lunch at the local diner, he struck up casual conversations with neighbors and fellow church members, testing the waters to see what others might have observed. Haven't seen much of Sarah Hartwell lately, he mentioned to Betty Morrison, who lived 2 streets over from the Hartwells. Now that you mention it, neither have I. Used to see her working in that beautiful garden of hers most afternoons, but I haven't noticed her outside in weeks. Figured maybe she was traveling or something. David's been keeping busy, though. Saw him coming and going at odd hours, early mornings, late nights. Must be work-related. At the hardware store, where David occasionally picked up supplies for home projects, the owner Tom Jenkins had similar observations. David's been in a few times recently, buying some unusual items, heavy-duty locks, some industrial cleaning supplies, things like that. Said he was doing some renovation work in the basement. Seemed nervous, though, kept checking his watch like he was in a hurry to get somewhere. Each conversation added another piece to a puzzle that Eli desperately hoped wouldn't form the picture he feared. But by mid-afternoon, the pattern was becoming undeniable. Sarah had essentially disappeared from her normal activities and social interactions. David was behaving strangely, making purchases that seemed odd for typical home improvement. And neighbors were noticing unusual comings and goings at the house. The board meeting that evening included David, as all deacons were required to attend. Eli watched him carefully during the discussions about church finances, the upcoming harvest, festival, and plans for the Christmas season. David participated normally, offering opinions and asking relevant questions. But when the topic turned to increasing the church's outreach to families in crisis, David's demeanor shifted. I think we need to be careful about getting too involved in people's personal business, David said, his voice carrying more edge than usual. Sometimes the best help we can offer is to respect people's privacy and let them work through their problems without interference. Deacon Harold Weber, 82, and as direct as they came, raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound much like the Good Samaritan to me, David. Since when do we let people suffer alone when we have the power to help? I'm just saying there's a difference between helping and meddling. Some situations are more complicated than they appear from the outside. Sometimes getting involved can make things worse for everyone. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that David's comments had been directed specifically at him. Was David somehow aware of his growing suspicions? Had someone mentioned Eli's casual questions around town? After the meeting, as the deacons were leaving, David lingered behind. Pastor Eli, could I have a word with you? They walked to Eli's office, where David closed the door behind them, something that struck Eli as unnecessary given the late hour and empty building. I wanted to talk to you about Sarah, David began, settling into the chair across from Eli's desk. I know people have been asking about her, and I appreciate the concern, but I need you to understand something. Eli folded his hands and waited. Sarah's been struggling with some personal issues lately. Depression, anxiety. You know how women can get sometimes, especially as they get older. She's embarrassed about it. Doesn't want people to see her when she's not at her best. That's why she's been staying home, avoiding social situations. Have you considered getting her professional help? I could recommend some excellent Christian counselors in the area. David's smile was tight. We're handling it as a family, with prayer and patience. Sarah specifically asked me to keep this private. She doesn't want to be the subject of church gossip or have people pitying her. I'm sure you understand the importance of respecting her wishes, of course. But David, if there's anything I can do as her pastor, actually there is something. David leaned forward. I need you to ask people to stop calling the house. Stop asking neighbors about us. The attention is making Sarah more anxious, making her condition worse. She feels like people are watching her, judging her. The best thing everyone can do right now is give our family space to heal. The request was reasonable on the surface, but something about David's tone made Eli's skin crawl. It was too controlled, too rehearsed, like a speech he'd practiced. I understand your concern for Sarah's privacy, Eli said carefully. But as her pastor, I do have a responsibility to check on members of our congregation, especially when they're struggling. David's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Sarah has everything she needs at home. She has a loving husband, a devoted daughter, and faith in God's plan. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is respect someone's need for solitude and healing. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. I trust I can count on you to help protect our family's privacy during this difficult time, Pastor. Sarah's recovery depends on it. After David left, Eli sat alone in his office, staring at the closed door. The conversation had been polite, reasonable even, but it had felt like a threat wrapped in religious language. David was essentially asking him to call off any investigation, to ignore his pastoral duties, and to trust that a woman who had completely withdrawn from all social contact was simply dealing with depression in private. But it was Lila's drawing that haunted him most. The basement door with its heavy black lines, the figure behind what looked like bars. Children drew what they saw, what they experienced. And if Lila had seen her mother locked in a basement, if she had tried to tell someone through the only safe way she knew how, whispered words during prayer time, then David's request for privacy took on a sinister meaning entirely. Eli pulled out his cell phone and stared at it for a long time before finally dialing information. I need the number. For Child Protective Services, he said quietly. Tomorrow he would begin asking the questions that David Hartwell didn't want asked. Tonight he would pray for the courage to see this through, no matter where it led or what it cost him personally. Because somewhere in town, a little girl was counting on the one adult she'd trusted with her terrible secret. And this time, unlike with Margaret, he would not look away from the signs of someone in desperate need of help. Tuesday afternoon found Eli standing on the front porch of 247 Maple Street, holding a small basket of baked goods from the church kitchen and fighting the nervous energy that had been building in his chest since dawn. The Hartwell house was a modest two-story colonial, painted white with blue shutters, surrounded by Sarah's once immaculate flower beds that now showed signs of neglect. The late-blooming mums were wilted, and weeds had begun to creep through the mulch. He'd spent the morning making phone calls, first to Child Protective Services, where he'd spoken to a social worker named Janet Pierce, who'd listened carefully to his concerns, but explained that they needed more concrete evidence to investigate. Then to Dr. Reynolds, his own physician, who'd helped him understand the signs of someone being held against their will. The conversation had left him feeling both more informed and more terrified of what he might discover. Before he could second-guess himself further, Eli rang the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house, followed by footsteps and the sound of multiple locks being undone. When the door opened, David's face appeared, his expression cycling quickly from surprise to forced pleasantness. Pastor Eli, What a nice surprise. What brings you by? I brought some of Martha's famous oatmeal cookies for Sarah, Eli said, holding up the basket. I know she's been under the weather, and I thought she might enjoy them with her afternoon tea. David made no move to step aside or invite him in. That's very thoughtful, but Sarah's resting right now. I'd hate to disturb her when she's finally getting some sleep. Of course. Perhaps I could just leave these in the kitchen and say a quick prayer for her recovery. For a moment, David's mask slipped, and Eli caught a glimpse of something that might have been panic, but it was gone so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. Well, I suppose that would be all right. But just for a moment, she really does need her rest. The interior of the house struck Eli immediately as wrong, though it took him a moment to identify why. Everything was perfectly clean, almost sterile, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Sarah's personal touches, the family photographs on the mantel, her collection of ceramic birds on the windowsill, the hand-embroidered throw pillows, were all still there, but they looked untouched, as if they'd been arranged for display rather than lived with. "Coffee?" David asked, leading him toward the kitchen. "I was just about to make some." "That would be nice, thank you." As David busied himself with the coffee maker, Eli took note of details that seemed significant. Business cards were scattered across the kitchen counter. Insurance companies, real estate firms, financial services. Some were David's, but many belonged to other agencies. As if he'd been meeting with various professionals about urgent matters. A stack of unopened mail sat by the phone, and Eli could see several bills marked "Final Notice" in red letters. "Business been challenging lately?" Eli asked casually, nodding toward the cards. David's hand paused over the coffee canister. "You know how it is in insurance, feast or famine. Things have been a bit tight, but we're managing. God provides, right? Indeed he does. Though sometimes he provides through the help of our community. If you folks need anything, we're fine," David said quickly. "Sarah and I have always been self-sufficient. We don't like to burden others with our problems." Eli noticed the way David kept glancing toward the stairs, as if listening for something. When the house's old heating system kicked on with a mechanical groan, David actually flinched. "Where's Lila this afternoon?" "Playing at a friend's house." "The Morrison girl from her class." David's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Sarah thought it would be good for her to get out of the house while Mommy recovers." But Eli knew the Morrison family well. Their daughter was 10, 3 years older than Lila, and the families had never been particularly close. It seemed unlikely that Lila would be invited for a play date during the school day. The coffee finished brewing, and David poured 2 cups, his hands noticeably unsteady. As he handed Eli his mug, a sound drifted down from upstairs, a soft thud like something falling or being dropped. David's eyes shot toward the ceiling. "Probably just the cat," he said, though Eli had never known the Hartwells to have a pet. "I'd love to say hello to Sarah, even if she's not feeling well. Perhaps I could just peek in and offer a prayer?" "She's sleeping," David repeated firmly. "The doctor said rest is the most important thing right now. I'm sure you understand." But as they stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee and making strained conversation about the upcoming harvest festival, Eli heard the sound again. A rhythmic tapping, like someone trying to get attention. It seemed to be coming from below rather than above, and David's increasing agitation confirmed that he heard it too. "David, is that sound coming from the basement?" "Old house," David said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "The furnace makes all kinds of noises. I keep meaning to have someone look at it." Eli set down his coffee cup and looked directly at David. "I'm concerned about Sarah. It's not like her to miss so many church activities, especially without calling. To explain, the women's ministry is worried about her. I told you she's dealing with depression. She doesn't want people to see her like this. Depression is a serious condition that often requires professional help. Has she seen a doctor, a counselor?" David's jaw tightened. "We're handling it through prayer and family support. Sarah's faith is strong. She doesn't need outsiders interfering in our personal business." The tapping sound came again, more insistent this time, and Eli watched David's face grow pale. "Perhaps I should check that furnace for you before I leave," Eli offered. "I'm fairly handy with mechanical things. That won't be necessary." David moved to block the basement door, which Eli now noticed had a new deadbolt lock installed, the kind that required a key to open from either side. "I've already called a repairman. He's coming tomorrow." The lie was so obvious that Eli felt his heart rate spike. In 23 years of pastoral work, he'd developed an instinct for when someone was hiding something serious. But this felt different. Not like embarrassment over financial troubles or family discord, but something darker and more dangerous. "David, I need to ask you directly, is Sarah all right? I mean, truly all right?" For a long moment they stared at each other. Across the kitchen, David's expression shifted through several emotions, calculation, anger, and what might have been desperation, before settling on cold determination. "Pastor Eli, I appreciate your concern, but you're overstepping. Sarah is my wife, and how we handle her health issues is our business. I need you to respect that and stop asking questions that are making my family uncomfortable. As your pastor, I have a responsibility. As our pastor, you have a responsibility to respect our privacy and support our decisions as a family." David moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I think it would be best if you left now, and I think it would be even better if you didn't come back unless you're invited." The threat was unmistakable now, wrapped in religious language, but carrying a weight that made Eli's mouth go dry. He looked once more toward the basement door, with its new lock, then back at David's face. "Of course," Eli said quietly, "I'll see myself out." As he walked to the front door, he could feel David watching his every step. The deadbolts clicked into place behind him before he'd even reached his car, and he noticed the curtains in the front window move as David continued to observe his departure. Sitting in his car at the end of the driveway, Eli's hands shook as he reached for his cell phone. The pieces were falling into place now, the financial stress evidenced by those overdue bills, the new locks on doors that had never needed them before, David's aggressive defensiveness, and most troubling of all, those sounds from the basement. He dialed Janet Pierce at Child Protective Services. Janet Pierce's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd heard too many stories like this one. She listened without interruption as Eli described his visit to the Hartwell home, the mysterious sounds from the basement, and David's increasingly hostile behavior. "Pastor Matthews, I understand your concerns, but what you're describing isn't enough for us to obtain a warrant or force entry into the home. We need evidence of immediate danger or a direct report from the victim herself. But what about the child? Lila told me, children say many things that can be misinterpreted. Without physical evidence of abuse or neglect or without corroboration from other sources, our hands are largely tied." Eli gripped the phone tighter. "So what can be done? Keep documenting everything you observe. If you can get Sarah to speak with you directly, or if you witness anything that constitutes clear evidence of a crime, call us immediately. In the meantime, I'll make some inquiries with local law enforcement to see if there have been any previous reports involving this family." After hanging up, Eli sat in his church office, feeling more helpless than he had since Margaret's final days in the hospital. The system designed to protect people seemed paralyzed by the very secrecy that endangered them most. Martha knocked on his doorframe, holding a manila folder. "Pastor, I have those attendance records you requested." The documentation painted a clear picture of Sarah's gradual withdrawal from church life. 3 months ago, she'd been present at every women's Bible study, every committee meeting, every social function. 2 months ago, her attendance became sporadic. 6 weeks ago, it stopped entirely. "Martha, in all your years here, has Sarah ever missed the annual planning meeting for the Christmas pageant?" "Never. She's coordinated it for the past 8 years. It's her favorite ministry." Martha studied the papers over Eli's shoulder. "Pastor, What's this really about? I've been fielding calls from concerned women all week. Nobody's seen Sarah anywhere. Not at the grocery store, not at Lila's school events, nowhere. Eli made a decision that would have significant consequences. Martha, I need to ask you to do something, and I need your word that you'll keep this confidential for now. Of course. I want you to call Sarah directly. Tell her you have questions about the Christmas pageant that only she can answer. See, if David will let you speak with her, or if he tries to intercept the call. Martha's eyes widened with understanding. You think something's wrong, don't you? I pray that I'm mistaken, but yes, I'm very concerned. 20 minutes later, Martha returned with troubling news. David answered the phone and said Sarah was too unwell to discuss church business. When I asked if I could just say a quick hello, he said she was sleeping and couldn't be disturbed. Pastor, in 12 years of working here, I've never known Sarah to be too sick to at least say hello on the phone. Did he say anything else? He asked who had requested that I call, and when I mentioned it was your idea, he became very short with me. Said Sarah didn't need people checking up on her constantly, and that the attention was making her condition worse. That evening, Eli drove through the residential neighborhoods surrounding the church, ostensibly making pastoral visits, but actually conducting his own investigation. At the small ranch house where the Morrison family lived, he stopped to check on elderly Mrs. Morrison's recovery from her recent surgery. During their conversation, he casually mentioned seeing David earlier. Oh yes, David stopped by this afternoon. To pick up Lila, Mrs. Morrison said. Such a devoted father. Though I was surprised he said she'd been playing with our Jenny. Jenny's been at her grandmother's house all week for fall break. Another lie. Eli felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his stomach. Mrs. Morrison, have you seen Sarah recently? Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her in quite some time. Used to wave to her when she worked in her garden, but I haven't noticed her outside in weeks. David said she's been under the weather. From the Hendersons, who lived directly behind the Hartwell house, Eli learned that they'd heard unusual sounds coming from the property late at night, what sounded like someone moving heavy objects, and occasionally what might have been crying or calling out, though they couldn't be sure. We thought about calling the police, Mr. Henderson admitted, but David's always been such a good neighbor. We figured it was probably just the television, or maybe Sarah having nightmares if she's been sick. At the corner market, where Sarah typically shopped twice a week, the clerk remembered her well, but hadn't seen her in over a month. She always bought the same things: ingredients for homemade bread, fresh vegetables, that expensive tea she liked. David's been coming in instead, but he buys different stuff. Frozen dinners, basic groceries, nothing like what she used to get. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, and by the time Eli returned to the church, he was convinced that Sarah Hartwell was either being held against her will or was dead. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. A woman had completely vanished from her normal life, and her husband was systematically lying about her whereabouts and condition. Back in his office, Eli found a pile of unopened mail on his desk that Martha had left for him. Among the usual newsletters and church business correspondence was an envelope with no return address, addressed simply to Pastor Eli in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in pencil. She's in the basement. He hurt her bad. Help us. The handwriting was shaky, like someone writing in the dark or under stress. At the bottom of the page was a small drawing, the same house Lila had drawn in Sunday school, but this time with more detail. The basement window showed a clear figure of a woman, and there were what looked like chains or bars across the small opening. Eli's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. This wasn't a child's imagination anymore. This was evidence. But as he started to dial Janet Pierce's number, he noticed something else in the envelope. A small piece of fabric torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. Before he could complete the call, his office phone rang. Pastor Eli, this is David Hartwell. The voice was controlled but carried an underlying tension that made Eli's Skin crawl. I understand you've been asking questions around the neighborhood about my family. David, I told you yesterday that Sarah needs privacy to recover. I thought I made it clear that your interference is making her condition worse. Eli looked at the note and fabric on his desk. Someone in that house was asking for help, risking everything to get a message to him. David, I think we need to have a more direct conversation. As Sarah's pastor, I have legitimate concerns about her welfare. Do you, Pastor? Because it seems to me like you're more interested in gossip and speculation than in respecting a family's right to handle their private matters privately. The threat in David's voice was unmistakable now. If I find out you're continuing to pry into my family's business, if I hear about any more phone calls or visits or questions about us, there will be consequences. I hope I'm making myself clear. Are you threatening me, David? I'm protecting my family from harmful interference. Sarah's recovery depends on peace and quiet, not on having the whole town speculating about her condition. I trust you'll respect that. The line went dead. Eli stared at the phone, then at the evidence spread across his desk. Someone in the Hartwell house had managed to get a cry for help to him, despite David's controlling behavior. The question now wasn't whether Sarah was in danger. It was whether Eli could find a way to help her before David realized his secret was out. He picked up his cell phone and dialed 911. Officer Rebecca Santos arrived at the church within 15 minutes of Eli's call, her patrol car's presence in the parking lot drawing curious glances from neighbors walking their dogs in the early evening light. She was younger than Eli had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she'd seen her share of difficult situations. Pastor Matthews? I'm Officer Santos. You called about a possible domestic situation. Eli led her into his office, where the anonymous note and fabric still lay spread across his desk. As Santos examined the evidence with gloved hands, Eli recounted everything. Lila's whispered confession, his observations during the house visit, the community's concerns about Sarah's disappearance, and David's increasingly threatening behavior. This handwriting, Santos said, studying the note carefully. Do you have any samples of Sarah Hartwell's writing for comparison? Martha, who had stayed late to help with the crisis, produced several documents from Sarah's file: volunteer forms, committee notes, thank you cards she'd written to church donors. The comparison was unmistakable. The shaky handwriting in the plea for help matched Sarah's normal script, though it was clearly written under stress. The fabric appears to have bloodstains, Santos noted, sealing it in an evidence bag. We can have this tested, but that takes time. Based on what you've told me, I think we have enough for a welfare check. Eli felt a surge of hope. You can go to the house. We can knock on the door and ask to see Sarah Hartwell in person to verify that she's safe and well. If David refuses, or if we observe anything suspicious, we can escalate from there. Santos radioed for backup, explaining that domestic situations were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. While they waited, she asked Eli more detailed questions about the family dynamics, David's behavior, and the timeline of Sarah's disappearance from community life. In your professional opinion as their pastor, do you believe David Hartwell is capable of violence? The question hung heavy in the air. Eli thought of his seminary textbook on pastoral care, its margins filled with notes about recognizing the signs of abuse, about the sacred responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Margaret had underlined a passage about how evil often wore the mask of respectability, how the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most trustworthy. 3 months ago, I would have said absolutely not, Eli replied honestly. David has been a model church member, generous, involved, respected by his peers. But people can hide darker sides of themselves very well, especially when their public reputation depends on it. And the man I spoke with yesterday, the one who threatened me over the phone tonight, that wasn't the David Hartwell I thought I knew. Officer Martinez, Santos's backup, arrived just as full darkness settled over the town. The two officers discussed strategy in low voices before turning back to Eli. "Pastor, we'd like you to come with us," Santos said. "If David sees patrol cars in his driveway without context, he might panic and do something desperate. But if you're there, it looks like a pastoral visit that happened to include police for safety reasons." The drive to Maple Street took only 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour to Eli. His palms were sweating, and he found himself praying not just for Sarah's safety, but for the wisdom to handle whatever they might find. The memory of Lila's drawing haunted him, that small figure behind bars in a basement window. The Hartwell house looked normal from the outside, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. David's car was in the driveway, and there were lights on in both the living room and kitchen. It looked like any other suburban home on any other evening, which somehow made the situation more surreal. Santos rang the doorbell while Martinez positioned himself where he could see the back of the house, in case anyone tried to leave that way. The wait seemed endless before they heard footsteps and the sound of locks being undone. David opened the door, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and barely controlled anger when he saw Eli flanked by 2 police officers. "Good evening, Mr. Hartwell. I'm Officer Santos, and this is Officer Martinez. We're here to conduct a welfare check on your wife, Sarah. We need to see her and verify that she's safe and well." "This is harassment," David said, his voice tight with rage. "I told Pastor Eli that my wife is ill and needs privacy. This is completely unnecessary." "Sir, we understand your concerns about your wife's privacy, but we have a legal obligation to verify her welfare when we receive reports of possible endangerment. We just need to see her and hear from her directly that she's okay." David's knuckles were white where he gripped the doorframe. "She's sleeping. I'm not waking her up because of some ridiculous paranoia from people who should mind their own business. Mr. Hartwell, I need you to wake your wife so we can speak with her. This isn't optional." For a moment, Eli thought David might slam the door in their faces, but Santos's hand had moved to rest casually on her service weapon, and Martinez had stepped closer to the entrance. "Fine," David said through gritted teeth, "but she's very ill, and this is going to upset her terribly." He led them into the living room, where Eli noticed more details that seemed wrong. The house was too clean, too sterile. Sarah's reading glasses weren't on the coffee table where she always kept them. Her knitting basket wasn't by her favorite chair. It was as if someone had erased her presence from the main living areas, while keeping just enough of her belongings visible to maintain the illusion that she still lived there. "I'll go get her," David said, heading toward the stairs. "Please, wait here." Santos nodded to Martinez, who quietly followed David partway up the staircase to ensure he actually went to get Sarah rather than attempting to escape or hide evidence. The next few minutes stretched like hours. Eli could hear muffled voices from upstairs, David's urgent whispers, and what might have been a woman's voice, weak and confused. Then footsteps on the stairs, slow and unsteady. When Sarah Hartwell appeared at the top of the staircase, Eli's heart nearly stopped. The woman he'd known for years as vibrant and caring was barely recognizable. She'd lost significant weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her normally bright hair was lank and unkempt, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. But it was her expression that disturbed him most, the look of someone who'd been broken by fear and isolation. David supported her arm as they descended, his grip appearing helpful but obviously controlling. Sarah's eyes darted nervously between the officers and Eli, and she seemed to shrink into herself when David's hand tightened on her elbow. "Sarah," Santos said gently, "I'm Officer Santos. We're here because people have been concerned about your welfare. Are you all right?" Sarah's mouth opened slightly, and for a moment Eli thought she might speak, but then her gaze flicked to David, and whatever she'd been about to say died in her throat. "She's fine," David answered for her, "just tired from being sick." This is Exactly the kind of stress I was trying to protect her from. "Mum, I need to hear from you directly," Santos pressed. "Are you safe? Are you here of your own free will?" Sarah's hands trembled as she looked again at David, then at Eli, then back to the officers. In her eyes, Eli saw a desperate war between hope and terror, the hope that these people might save her, and the terror of what David might do if she asked for help. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm fine, just not feeling well." But as she spoke, Eli noticed her left hand moving behind her back, making small gestures that David couldn't see from his position. She was pointing downward, toward the basement, her finger spelling out letters. HELP. Santos caught the gesture too. Her expression didn't change, but Eli saw her exchange a meaningful look with Martinez. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Martha arrived at the church before sunrise, clutching a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper with hands that shook from more than just the autumn cold. "Pastor, I found these in the lost and found box when I was cleaning it out," she said, unwrapping the tissue to reveal several torn pages of what appeared to be a personal journal. They were tucked under some old mittens and scarves. I think they're Sarah's." Eli took the pages carefully, recognizing Sarah's handwriting immediately. The entries were dated over the past 6 months, and as he read them, a horrifying picture of escalating abuse emerged. March 15th. "David lost another big client today. He's been drinking more, and when he drinks, he gets angry about everything. I tried to stay out of his way, but it's hard when Lila asks why Daddy is so mad all the time." April 2nd. "He grabbed my arm so hard during church that I had to wear long sleeves for a week to hide the bruises. Deacon Peterson complimented him on his leadership during the board meeting. If only they knew." April 20th. "Found David going through our savings account online. We're almost broke. When I asked about it, he said it was none of my business, and that I should be grateful he doesn't make me get a job like other men's wives." The way he said it scared me. May 8th. "David installed new locks on the house. Says it's for security, but he's the only one with keys. I can't leave without him knowing. When I mentioned needing groceries, he said he'd take care of the shopping from now on." The entries grew more desperate as the dates progressed. June 15th. "He hit me today. Really hit me, not just grabbing or pushing. Lila was at school, thank God. I told him I was going to leave, and he laughed. Said I had nowhere to go, no money, and no one would believe me over him anyway." July 3rd. "David cleared out our joint account. Says it's to protect our assets, but I know it's to keep me trapped. I tried to call my sister in Cleveland, but he's done something to the phones. They only work for him now." The final entries were the most chilling. August 10th. "I made the mistake of talking to Mrs. Henderson over the fence yesterday. Just normal conversation, but David flew into a rage when he got home. Says I'm not allowed to talk to neighbors anymore. That people are gossiping about our family." August 18th. "He's talking about the basement more and more. Says if I can't behave like a proper wife, maybe I need some time to think about my responsibilities. The way he looks at me when he says it makes my blood run cold." August 25th. "David brought home chains and padlocks today. Said they're for his workshop, but he doesn't have a workshop. I'm scared. I'm so scared, but I don't know what to do. If I try to run, he'll catch me. If I call for help, who would believe that David Hartwell, respected deacon, could do such things?" The final entry was dated just 6 weeks ago, September 8th. "This might be my last entry. David found my hiding place for this journal and tore out most of the pages. He doesn't know I saved these few. If anything happens to me, I need someone to know the truth. He's not the man people think he is. Please, if someone finds this, help my daughter. Don't let her grow up thinking this is what love looks like." Martha had been reading over Eli's shoulder, her face growing pale. "Pastor, we have to call the police." "We will, but first I need to know how these pages got into our lost and found box. I've been thinking about that. The last time Sarah was at church was for the women's Bible study 6 weeks ago. She seemed nervous, kept looking toward the door like she was expecting someone. Maybe she hid these pages somewhere and hoped someone would find them. Eli studied the torn edges of the pages, imagining Sarah desperately trying to leave some record of what was happening to her, some way to call for help, even if she couldn't speak the words aloud. Before he could call Officer Santos, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Lila's elementary school. Pastor Matthews, this is Principal Wilson at Oakwood Elementary. I'm calling because Lila Hartwell hasn't been to school in 3 days, and when we called home, her father said she was sick. But our school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, saw Lila at the grocery store yesterday afternoon, and she looked fine physically but very distressed emotionally. Eli's blood ran cold. What exactly did Mrs. Patterson observe? Lila was with her father, and she seemed afraid to speak or move without his permission. When Mrs. Patterson approached to say hello, the child actually flinched. Mr. Hartwell was very abrupt and rushed Lila away before any real conversation could take place. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. David wasn't just isolating Sarah, he was isolating Lila too, probably to prevent her from talking to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Principal Wilson, I need you to contact child protective services immediately. I believe Lila may be in danger. After ending the call, Eli immediately dialed Officer Santos, who listened grimly as he read from Sarah's journal entries. Pastor, this changes everything. We have documented evidence of escalating domestic violence and what appears to be unlawful imprisonment. I'm going to get a warrant to search that house, and I'm going to get it today. What about Sarah? And Lila, if David realizes we have this evidence, we'll have officers watching the house starting now. If he tries to leave with them, we'll intervene immediately. Within an hour, the machinery of law enforcement was in motion. Officers Martinez and Johnson took up discreet surveillance positions around the Hartwell house, while Santos worked with the district attorney to obtain search and arrest warrants. Social services was alerted about Lila's situation, and a crisis team was assembled to handle what everyone now understood was a potentially deadly domestic violence case. But at noon, Officer Martinez radioed in with disturbing news. David Hartwell just loaded 2 large suitcases into his car. It looks like he's preparing to leave. Santos's voice crackled over the radio. Do not let him leave with those females. Stop him if necessary. Eli sat in his church office, staring at Sarah's journal pages and feeling utterly helpless. Somewhere across town, a man who had fooled an entire congregation was about to be confronted with evidence of his crimes. A woman who had been trapped and tortured was about to learn whether her desperate cry for help would save her or doom her. And a little girl who had whispered her terrible secret during prayer time was caught in the middle of it all. Martha brought him a cup of coffee with hands that still trembled. Pastor, what do you think will happen? Eli looked at the photograph of Margaret on his desk, then at the cross hanging on his wall. I think we're about to find out whether justice and mercy can triumph over evil, he said quietly. And I think Sarah Hartwell is about to discover that someone finally heard her cry for help. The radio crackled again. Units responding to 247 Maple Street. Suspect is barricaded inside with hostages. Request backup and crisis negotiator. The final confrontation had begun. Officer Santos arrived at the church within minutes, her face grim as she spread additional documents across Eli's desk, alongside Sarah's journal pages. Pastor, we've uncovered something that makes this situation far worse than we initially believed. The documents she produced were official police reports, yellowed with age and marked with case numbers from 3 years earlier. Eli's heart sank. As he read the header, Domestic Violence Report, Complainant Sarah Michelle Hartwell. Sarah filed a formal complaint against David 3 years ago, Santos explained. According to the report, he'd beaten her severely enough to require emergency room treatment. She had documentation, photographs of bruises, medical records, witness statements from hospital staff. Eli scanned the report, his horror growing with each detail. The attending physician had noted injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse, old fractures that had healed incorrectly, scarring from what appeared to be cigarette burns, and fresh trauma that suggested David had used both his fists and possibly objects to hurt his wife. "What happened to the case?" Santos's expression darkened. Sarah withdrew the complaint 48 hours later, said it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd fallen downstairs and been confused from a concussion when she blamed her husband. The case was closed, but the investigating officer, Detective Morrison, who's retired now, made detailed notes about his concerns. She handed Eli another document, this one a memo from Detective Morrison's personal files. "In 30 years of police work, I've never seen someone withdraw a complaint with this much evidence unless they were under severe duress or threat." David Hartwell presented as charming and concerned during questioning, but there was something calculating about his demeanor that troubled me. He answered questions too smoothly, as if he'd rehearsed his responses. "I believe Sarah Hartwell is in significant danger, but without her cooperation, our hands are tied." The twist was devastating in its implications. This wasn't the beginning of David's abuse. It was the culmination of years of escalating violence. Sarah had tried to escape once before, had gathered the courage to seek help from the very system designed to protect her, only to be forced back into silence by threats they could only imagine. "There's more," Santos continued, producing a manila folder thick with additional documents. "We've been in contact with Detective Morrison, and he's provided us with his complete file on the family. David has a history we never knew about." The file revealed a pattern of manipulation and control that went back to the early years of the Hartwells' marriage. Credit reports showed David systematically destroying Sarah's financial independence, closing accounts in her name, ruining her credit score, and ensuring she had no access to money or resources. Medical records from Sarah's doctor showed a pattern of injuries over the years, always explained away as accidents, but occurring with suspicious frequency. Most chilling was a statement from Sarah's sister in Cleveland, taken during the original investigation, but never followed up on. "Sarah called me 2 weeks before she went to the police, crying and saying David had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave him. She said he'd told her he'd make it look like an accident, and that no one would ever believe her over him because of his reputation in the church. She was terrified, but she said she couldn't live like that anymore. Couldn't let Lila grow up seeing marriage as a prison." But the real bombshell came in Detective Morrison's final notes. During a follow-up visit to check on Sarah's welfare after she withdrew the complaint, I observed David in the process of digging what appeared to be a large hole in his backyard. When questioned, he claimed he was installing a septic system, but no permits had been filed with the city, and the location was nowhere near appropriate utility lines. I requested a second welfare check on Sarah 1 week later, and David claimed she was visiting relatives out of state. No one has been able to verify this claim. Eli felt the blood drain from his face. "You think he was digging her grave 3 years ago?" "We think Sarah's escape attempt 3 years ago nearly got her killed, and that David has been planning her murder ever since. The basement imprisonment wasn't just about control. It was about keeping her alive until he could figure out how to dispose of her body without raising suspicion." Santos spread out additional documents that painted an even more horrifying picture. Financial records showed David had recently purchased life insurance policies on both Sarah and Lila, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. He'd also been meeting with lawyers about updating his will and had made inquiries about selling the house. "He's been planning to kill them both," Santos said bluntly. "Make it look like a murder-suicide, or like Sarah had a breakdown and hurt herself and Lila before disappearing. With Sarah's history of depression that he's been establishing in the community, and with her withdrawal from all social activities, it would be believable that she'd had a mental health crisis." The radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All units, suspect has barricaded himself in the basement with both hostages. We can hear crying and what sounds like construction activity. Request immediate backup and crisis negotiation team. Eli's worst fears were being realized in real time. David wasn't just holding Sarah and Lila hostage. He was in the basement where he'd been keeping Sarah prisoner, possibly putting his final plan into motion. Santos was already moving toward the door when her radio buzzed again. "Detective Santos, we've got a problem. Suspect has contacted local news media. He's claiming his wife is mentally ill and has barricaded herself in the basement with their daughter. Says he's trying to get help for them and that police are overreacting to false reports from concerned church members." The manipulation was breathtakingly audacious. Even facing exposure and arrest, David was still trying to control the narrative, to make himself appear as the concerned husband dealing with a mentally unstable wife. "He's running out of options," Santos said grimly. "That makes him incredibly dangerous. Cornered domestic abusers often escalate to murder-suicide rather than face the consequences of their actions." As they rushed toward Santos's patrol car, Eli's mind reeled with the implications of everything they'd discovered. Sarah hadn't just been imprisoned for weeks. She'd been living under a death sentence for 3 years, knowing that David was planning to kill her, but unable to escape or get help. The depression David had described to the congregation wasn't mental illness. It was the behavior of a woman living in constant fear for her life and her daughter's safety. And Lila, sweet 7-year-old Lila, who trusted him with her whispered secret, had been living in a house where her father was planning to murder both her and her mother. The drive to Maple Street revealed a scene that looked like something from a television crime drama. Police cars lined the street, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows in the afternoon sun. Officers had established a perimeter around the Hartwell house, and neighbors stood in worried clusters behind police tape, trying to understand how their quiet suburban street had become the center of a hostage situation. Crisis negotiator Lieutenant Patricia Hayes was setting up communication equipment when Santos and Eli arrived. She briefed them quickly on the situation. David had barricaded all entrances to the basement and was refusing to communicate with police. The sounds coming from inside suggested he was either destroying evidence or preparing to carry out violence against his hostages. "We've tried calling the landline, but he's not answering," Hayes explained. "We can hear movement and what sounds like crying, but we can't establish communication. Without knowing his mental state or his immediate plans, we're operating blind." It was then that Eli had an idea that would either save Sarah and Lila or doom them all. "Lieutenant, what if I tried to communicate with him, not as part of law enforcement, but as his pastor? He might be willing to talk to someone he trusts, someone who represents the community where he's built his reputation." Santos shook her head immediately. "Absolutely not. This man has been planning multiple murders for years. He's desperate and dangerous, and he's already threatened you personally. I won't put you at risk." But Eli was already walking toward the house, driven by the same moral certainty that had brought him this far. "David!" he called out loudly. "David, it's Pastor Eli. I know you're scared and confused right now. I want to help you work through this." The response came through a basement window, David's voice muffled but audible. "Pastor Eli! Thank God you're here. Sarah's having a complete breakdown. She's got Lila down here and she won't let me help them. I think she might hurt herself or the baby." Even in his desperation, David was still lying, still trying to manipulate the situation. But Eli could also hear something else in his voice, genuine fear that his carefully constructed world was finally collapsing around him. Lieutenant Hayes grabbed Eli's arm before he could take another step toward the house. "Pastor Matthews, I understand your desire to help, but this is an extremely volatile situation. David Hartwell has been planning murders for years. He's not going to be reasoned with by pastoral counseling." Eli gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, you don't know this man the way I do. For 23 years, I've counseled people through their darkest moments. David is desperate right now, but he's also clinging to his public image. He won't want to be seen as a monster by his pastor. Santos stepped between them, her expression torn between professional protocol and the recognition that conventional tactics weren't working. Pastor, even if you're right about his psychology, he's already threatened you personally. The moment he realizes you're the one who exposed him, he could become violent. He's already violent, Eli replied quietly, looking toward the basement windows where they could occasionally see shadows moving behind the glass. The question is whether we can reach whatever humanity he has left before he decides he has nothing left to lose. From his jacket pocket, Eli pulled out a small leather-bound book, his father's war medal, awarded for valor during the Korean War, pressed between the pages of a pocket Bible. He'd carried it every day since his father's funeral. 15 years ago, a reminder of the courage that ran in his family when the stakes were highest. My father once told me that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being terrified. He earned this medal by running into enemy fire to save wounded soldiers. I've spent my entire ministry talking about faith and courage from the safety of a pulpit. Maybe it's time I put my convictions to the test. Lieutenant Hayes was already coordinating with her team, but she turned back to Eli with reluctant respect. If we allow this, you follow our protocols exactly. You wear a wire so we can monitor every word. You don't enter the house under any circumstances. And if we give you the signal to withdraw, you move immediately. As the crisis team prepared their equipment, Eli found himself in a state of heightened awareness that reminded him of the morning Margaret had passed away. Everything seemed sharper, more significant. The autumn air carrying the scent of dying leaves, the distant sound of church bells marking the hour, the weight of his father's medal in his palm. He thought of all the sermons he'd preached about shepherds protecting their flocks, about standing up for the powerless, about answering God's call even when it led through dark valleys. Officer Martinez approached with the wire equipment. "Pastor, this transmitter will let us hear everything. The range is good up to about 50 yards, so we'll be able to monitor even if you need to get closer to the house." As they fitted the small device under his shirt, Eli caught sight of his reflection in a patrol car window. At 58, with silver hair and lines around his eyes earned through decades of caring for others, he looked like exactly what he was. A small-town pastor who'd lived a quiet, contemplative life, not someone who belonged in the middle of a hostage crisis. But then he thought of Lila's small voice during prayer time, of Sarah's desperate journal entries, of all the times he'd failed to act when action was needed. "David," he called out again, moving closer to the house while staying within the safe perimeter the officers had established. "I know you're frightened right now. I know this situation seems impossible. But I also know the man I've served alongside for years. The man who's helped build our church, who's been a leader in our community. That man is still there, and I believe he wants to do the right thing." This time, David's response came more quickly. "Pastor Eli, I'm so glad you're here. Sarah's having some kind of breakdown, and she won't listen to me. She's got Lila down here, and I'm worried she might—" His voice broke, and for a moment, Eli almost believed the performance. "I just want to get help for my family." The psychology of the situation was becoming clearer to Eli. David wasn't just lying to the police and the community. He was lying to himself, creating a narrative where he was the victim, where his wife's desperate attempts to escape were evidence of her mental illness rather than his abuse. "David, I can hear the pain in your voice. This must be incredibly difficult for you. Can you tell me exactly what Sarah is doing that has you so concerned?" She's saying things that don't make sense. Claiming I hurt her. Claiming I've been keeping her prisoner. Pastor, you know me. You know I would never hurt my family. But she's gotten these ideas in her head, and now she won't let me help her. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring the conversation through her headphones, made notes on a pad and showed them to Santos. Classic abuser language. denying reality, claiming victim is delusional, positioning himself as the concerned party. Eli took another step closer to the house, now standing at the edge of the front yard. David, I wonder if maybe Sarah is scared right now. Sometimes when people are frightened, they say things that might not sound rational to us, but make perfect sense to them. Can you help me understand what she's afraid of? There was a long pause before David responded, and when he did, his voice carried more edge than before. I think some people have been filling her head with lies, Pastor. People who should have minded their own business instead of interfering. In our private family matters. The threat was clear, and Eli felt his pulse quicken, but he also heard something else in David's voice. Uncertainty, as if his carefully constructed world of denial was beginning to crack. David, I want you to know that everything I've done has been out of concern for your family's welfare. When a child reaches out for help, when a community member expresses fear, it's my responsibility as a pastor to respond. That's not interference, that's love. Lila doesn't need help. Sarah doesn't need help. They need to be left alone to work through this as a family. For the first time, they could hear other voices through the basement window, a woman's voice, weak but persistent, and a child crying. The sounds sent chills through everyone listening. Santos spoke quietly into her radio. Can we get a tactical team positioned near those basement windows? If we need to extract the hostages, we need to know exactly where they are. Eli pressed forward with his approach, knowing that time was running out. David, I can hear that Sarah and Lila are upset. Maybe if I could talk to them directly, I could help calm them down. As their pastor, I might be able to provide comfort that they can't get from anyone else right now. No! David's voice cracked with desperation. They can't. She can't talk to anyone right now. She's not thinking clearly. She'll just say more crazy things that will make everyone misunderstand the situation. It was then that Eli heard something that changed his entire approach to the crisis. Through the basement window came a sound he recognized from his years of hospital visits and deathbed vigils, the sound of someone struggling to breathe, someone in immediate physical distress. David, is Sarah injured? Does she need medical attention? The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, and when David finally responded, his voice was different, flatter, more controlled, as if he'd made some internal decision. Pastor Eli, I think you should know something. Sarah tried to hurt herself yesterday. She's been talking about ending things, about not wanting to live with her depression anymore. I've been trying to protect her, trying to keep her safe until I could get professional help. But she's getting worse, and now she's saying she wants to hurt Lila too. The lie was so audacious, so calculated, that it took Eli's breath away. David was setting up his final narrative, the story he would tell. After Sarah and Lila were dead, the mentally ill wife who killed her daughter and then herself, while her devoted husband tried desperately to save them. Lieutenant Hayes was already signaling to her tactical team, but Eli knew they were running out of time for any solution that didn't end in tragedy. David, listen to me very carefully. I know you're a good man who's been dealing with an impossible situation. But Sarah and Lila need medical attention right now, and they need it from professionals. Let me come to the basement door, and we can work together to get them the help they need. You can't come down here, Pastor. It's not safe. She's not herself right now. But as David spoke, Eli heard something else through the window. Sarah's voice, so weak it was barely audible, but clearly calling his name. Pastor Eli, please, help. As the sound was cut off abruptly, followed by what sounded like a struggle, and David's voice, sharp with panic. Sarah, stop it! You're scaring Lila! Lieutenant Hayes was already giving orders to her team. Move now! We have evidence of imminent danger to the hostages. But Eli was already moving too, driven by 23 years of pastoral instinct and the certain knowledge that if he didn't act immediately, Sarah and Lila Hartwell would die in the basement of their own home, while a community of people who claimed to love them stood helplessly outside. The final confrontation was about to begin. And everything depended on whether a small-town pastor could find the right words to reach whatever remained of David Hartwell's conscience, or whether courage and faith would be enough to save two innocent lives from a man who had already decided they needed to die. The front door of the Hartwell house stood slightly ajar, and Eli realized that David had left it open deliberately, an invitation or perhaps a trap. With tactical officers positioning themselves around the property's perimeter, Eli approached the entrance with his father's war medal clutched in his left hand and his church keys in his right. For 23 years, these keys had granted him access to homes in crisis, had opened doors where comfort and counsel were needed. Now they felt both familiar and foreign in his trembling fingers. "David, I'm coming to the front door now," Eli called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "I want to help you and your family through this." The response came from deeper in the house now, David's voice echoing up from what must be the basement stairs. "Pastor, you can't come down here. Sarah's gotten violent. She's hurt Lila." Even as David spoke, Eli could hear the obvious lie in his words. Through his earpiece, Lieutenant Hayes whispered, "He's trying to justify whatever he's done or is about to do. Keep him talking, but don't go into that house." But Sarah's earlier cry for help still echoed in Eli's mind, and he knew with pastoral certainty that every second of delay increased the danger to both hostages. He pushed open the front door and stepped into the foyer, immediately struck by the overwhelming smell of bleach and something else, something metallic and wrong. The house was eerily quiet except for the sound of David's movements somewhere. Below, Eli noticed that furniture had been moved, creating clear pathways, as if David had been preparing for some kind of confrontation or escape. Most disturbing were the plastic sheets draped over the couch and chairs, the kind used for painting, or Eli realized with horror, for containing blood spatter. "David, I'm in your living room now. I can see you've been working hard to take care of things. This situation must be exhausting for you." "Pastor Eli, please, you have to understand. I've been trying to protect everyone. Sarah's been saying terrible things, making accusations that could destroy our family, destroy everything we've built in this community." As David spoke, Eli moved carefully toward the basement door, noting the heavy-duty locks that had been installed, just as the neighbors had reported. But now all the locks were open, hanging loose on their hasps, as if David had been in such a hurry to get into the basement that he hadn't bothered to secure them again. Through the open basement door, Eli could hear sounds that chilled him to the bone. Labored breathing, what might have been whimpering, and the scrape of something heavy being dragged across concrete. Whatever David was doing down there, he was running out of time to complete it. "David, I'm going to come down and help you with Sarah and Lila. As their pastor, I have a responsibility to make sure they're safe." "No! Pastor, you can't. She's dangerous right now. She tried to attack me with a kitchen knife. I had to restrain her for everyone's safety." But as Eli reached the top of the basement stairs, he could see down into the space that had become Sarah's prison. The scene below defied every lie David had been telling. Sarah was chained to a support beam, her wrists bloody from struggling against the metal restraints. She was conscious but clearly injured, her face bruised and her breathing shallow. Beside her, Lila sat huddled in a corner, clutching her small children's Bible and staring up at the stairs with eyes full of terror. And David stood in the center of it all, holding a pistol that Eli hadn't known he owned. "Pastor Eli," David said, his voice now completely different, cold and calculating rather than desperate, "I really wish you hadn't come down here." The transformation was complete. Gone was any pretense of being the concerned husband and father. This was the David that Sarah had been living with for years, the man who could plan murders while teaching Sunday school, who could beat his wife while serving communion, who could terrorize a child while being praised as a model father. David. "I can see that Sarah and Lila need immediate medical attention. Whatever's happened here, we can work through it together. You're not beyond redemption." David laughed, a sound devoid of humor or hope. Redemption, Pastor. You have no idea what you've walked into. Do you know what Sarah told the police 3 years ago? Do you know what lies she spread about me before I convinced her to take them back? I know she was afraid. I know she reached out for help and didn't get it. She nearly destroyed everything. My reputation, my business, my standing. In the church. All because she couldn't understand that marriage requires sacrifice, requires submission. I built a good life for us, and she was willing to throw it all away over a few arguments that got out of hand. As David spoke, Eli noticed Sarah trying to communicate something, her eyes moving deliberately toward a corner of the basement where something was partially hidden under a tarp. Following her gaze, he realized with horror that David had already dug a hole in the concrete floor, not a grave this time, but a space large enough to conceal 2 bodies. The thing is, Pastor, David continued, the gun now pointed directly at Eli, I really did try to handle this quietly. Keep Sarah out of sight until I could figure out how to make her disappearance look natural. Maybe she ran away, couldn't handle being a mother and wife anymore. Maybe she had an accident somewhere far from home. But you had to interfere. Had to ask questions, had to bring the police into our private family business. Through his earpiece, Eli could hear Lieutenant Hayes coordinating with her tactical team, but he knew they couldn't move without risking the lives of everyone in the basement. David, Lila is right there listening to everything you're saying. Whatever problems you and Sarah are having, she doesn't need to be traumatized by. Lila already knows too much, David said, glancing at his daughter with an expression that made Eli's blood run cold. She's the one who started this whole mess, running her mouth to you during prayer time, 7 years old and already unable to keep family secrets. It was then that Eli understood the full scope of David's plan. This wasn't just about silencing Sarah, it was about eliminating everyone who knew his secret, including his own child. The basement fell into a tense silence, broken only by Sarah's labored breathing and the sound of Lila's quiet sobbing. David kept the gun trained on Eli, while seeming to calculate his next move, his eyes darting between his 3 potential victims with the cold assessment of someone who had already crossed the line from abuser to killer. You know what the real tragedy is, Pastor, David said, his voice carrying a disturbing calm. I actually respected you. 23 years of faithful service to this community, and you threw it all away because you couldn't mind your own business. Eli took a small step closer to Lila, positioning himself between the child and her father. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held both terror and desperate hope, still clutching the small children's Bible that had become her anchor in this nightmare. David, I can see you're in pain. Whatever's brought you to this point, there's still a way forward. That doesn't involve more violence. More violence? David's laugh was bitter. Pastor, you have no idea what real violence looks like. You think a few bruises on Sarah's face is violence? You think keeping my wife in line is violence? You've lived such a sheltered life, counseling people through their little problems from the comfort of your office. As David spoke, Eli noticed Sarah making subtle gestures with her bound hands, pointing towards something behind David's position. Following her indication, he saw a metal toolbox partially hidden behind the furnace, and more importantly, he saw the basement's exterior access door, the kind that opened directly to the backyard. David, let's talk about what you really want here. You're a smart man. You've managed to fool an entire community for years. You know this situation can't end well for anyone unless we find a peaceful solution. Peaceful. David's grip tightened on the weapon. There's only one solution now, Pastor. Sarah dies because she's a threat to our family's reputation. Lila dies because she can't keep her mouth shut. And you die because you couldn't leave well enough alone. The casual way David spoke about murdering his own child sent a chill through Eli that had nothing to do with the basement's concrete walls. This wasn't a man in the grip of passion or temporary madness. This was someone who had methodically planned multiple murders and convinced himself they were justified. And then what, David? You kill 3 people, and somehow your reputation survives. Somehow you go back to serving as a deacon, teaching Sunday school, living as a pillar of the community. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across David's face. I'll figure something out. Maybe Sarah finally snapped, killed you and Lila before turning the gun on herself. Tragic case of mental illness, devastating for the surviving husband. It was then that Lila spoke for the first time since Eli had entered the basement, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, please don't hurt Pastor Eli. He's a good man." David's expression shifted to something that might have been pain, but it passed quickly, replaced by renewed determination. "Lila, sweetheart, you don't understand adult things. Sometimes people have to make hard choices to protect their families. But Mommy's not bad, Daddy. She's just scared." "Lila, stop talking." But the child continued, her voice growing stronger, as she held her Bible tighter. "In Sunday school, Pastor Eli taught us that God wants us to tell the truth. He said lying hurts people." "Lila," I said, "stop!" David's roar echoed through the basement, but instead of cowering, Lila stood up slowly, still clutching her Bible. At 7 years old, she was making a choice that took more courage than most adults. "Good muster. I don't want to lie anymore, Daddy. I don't want to pretend Mommy is sick when you're the one who hurt her." The transformation in David was immediate and terrifying. Whatever restraint he'd been maintaining snapped, and he swung the gun toward his daughter with an expression of pure rage. But Eli was already moving. 23 years of visiting hospital rooms and comforting the dying had taught him to recognize the moment when someone made peace with their own mortality. He launched himself at David, driven not by physical courage, but by the absolute certainty that he would not let a child die while he stood by and watched. The impact sent both men crashing into the basement wall. David was younger and stronger, but Eli had desperation and righteous fury on his side. As they struggled for control of the weapon, Eli heard sounds from upstairs, boots on hardwood floors, shouted commands, the systematic clearing of rooms by law enforcement. The gun discharged once, the sound deafening in the confined space. For a moment, Eli thought he'd been shot, but the bullet had gone wide, embedding itself in the concrete wall inches from where Sarah was chained. "Get away from him, Pastor!" Sarah's voice, stronger now than it had been in weeks, cut through the chaos. "There's another gun in the toolbox!" David broke free from Eli's grip and scrambled toward the toolbox. But tactical officers were already coming through the basement door, their flashlights cutting through the dimness, their weapons. Trained on the scene below? "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground now!" But David wasn't listening. He had the second gun in his hands and was turning toward Lila, his face a mask of desperate fury. In his mind, if he couldn't control the narrative, if he couldn't maintain his perfect facade, then everyone who threatened it had to die. It was Lila who saved them all. As her father raised the weapon toward her, she did something that stopped him cold. She began to pray, her clear young voice carrying the words of the Lord's Prayer through the basement. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." David froze, the gun wavering in his hands, as his 7-year-old daughter faced her potential death with more faith and dignity than he had shown in years of supposedly faithful living. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church with the same gentle beauty it had always possessed, but everything else had changed. Pastor Eli Matthews stood at his office window, watching the early congregants arrive for Sunday service, his left arm still bearing the scar from where David's second shot had grazed him during those final, desperate moments in the basement. The sound of Lila's prayer that day had broken something fundamental in David Hartwell. Faced with his daughter's innocent faith, in the moment he was preparing to kill her, he had simply collapsed, the fight going out of him as completely as air from a punctured balloon. The tactical officers had secured the scene within minutes. But it was Lila's words, "Our Father who art in heaven," that had ended the violence. Now, as Eli prepared for the morning service, he could see Sarah and Lila Hartwell walking up the church steps together, hands clasped, both bearing the invisible scars of their ordeal, but walking with the dignity of survivors. Sarah had spent 2 months in physical therapy, rebuilding strength. In muscles that had atrophied during her imprisonment, the emotional healing was taking longer, but she was making remarkable progress with the help of a trauma counselor and the unwavering support of a congregation that had learned hard lessons. But looking beyond surface appearances, the photograph on Eli's desk had changed too. Margaret's wedding picture still held its place of honor, but beside it now sat a new family photo. Sarah and Lila, taken at the church's Christmas pageant just 3 months after their rescue. Sarah's smile in the new picture was tentative, but genuine, and Lila's eyes held the light that had been missing during those dark weeks when her world had been consumed by fear and secrets. The church itself had undergone its own transformation. The Board of Deacons had implemented new policies for recognizing and responding to domestic violence, working with local law enforcement and social services to ensure that future cries for help wouldn't go unheeded. They'd established a discretionary fund for families escaping abusive situations, and they'd brought in speakers to educate the congregation about the warning signs they'd all missed in the Hartwell family. David Hartwell was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, convicted on charges of kidnapping, aggravated assault, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, not just the physical proof from the basement prison, but also testimony from neighbors, church members, and medical professionals who had documented years of escalating abuse. His final attempt to claim mental illness as a defense had crumbled when prosecutors presented evidence of his meticulous planning and his systematic efforts to isolate and control his victims. Martha Brennan knocked on Eli's doorframe, holding the morning's bulletin and wearing the smile that had become more frequent since the crisis had taught them all the value of paying attention to the details that mattered. "Pastor, Sarah wanted me to give you this before service starts." She handed him a sealed envelope with his name written in Sarah's now steady handwriting. Inside was a thank you note, but also something more precious, a small piece of paper torn from what appeared to be a new journal. "Pastor Eli," the note began, "I've started writing again. Not about fear this time, but about hope, about second chances and the kindness of people who see beyond the surface to the heart of those who are hurting. Lila and I are building a new life, one day at a time, and we wanted you to know that your courage to act when it mattered most gave us the chance to discover who we could be when we weren't living in fear. I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened, but about choosing to believe that our future can be different from our past. Lila is back to asking thoughtful questions in Sunday school, and yesterday she told me she wants to be a pastor when she grows up, because pastors help people who can't help themselves. Thank you for hearing her whispered prayer that Sunday morning. Thank you for refusing to look away when looking away would have been easier. Thank you for showing us both what it means when someone chooses love over comfort, courage over safety. We'll see you at service. We're sitting in the front row today." Eli folded the note carefully and placed it in his Bible next to the bookmark that held his father's war medal. The medal had been returned to him after serving as evidence in David's trial, and now it served a different purpose, not as a symbol of inherited courage, but as a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes demanded it. The church bells chimed the hour, calling the faithful to worship. As Eli gathered his sermon notes, he reflected on the message he would deliver today, about shepherds who leave the 99 to seek the one who is lost, about communities that choose vigilance over willful blindness, about the sacred responsibility they all shared to protect the vulnerable among them. Walking toward the sanctuary, he passed the church's memorial wall, where a new plaque had been installed. In memory of all who suffer in silence and in honor of those who find the courage to speak for them. The sanctuary was fuller than it had been in years. Word of what had happened in their community had spread, drawing people who were searching for a church that took seriously the call to care for one another. But it was the sight of Sarah and Lila in the front pew that filled Eli's heart with the deepest gratitude. Lila caught his eye and waved, the gesture so normal and childlike that it brought tears to his eyes. She was wearing a yellow dress that matched her bright smile, and beside her, Sarah sat with the posture of someone who no longer had to look over her shoulder in fear. As the opening hymn began, Amazing Grace, chosen by Sarah herself, Eli thought about the long journey that had brought them all to this moment. A whispered confession during prayer time had led to the exposure of years of hidden suffering, but it had also led to redemption, healing, and the discovery that a community united in purpose could overcome even the darkest secrets. The grace they sang about wasn't just theological concept anymore. It was the lived experience of people who had found their way from darkness to light, from silence to truth, from despair to hope. And in the voices of Sarah and Lila, singing with joy. That would have been impossible just 6 months earlier. Eli heard the sound of prayers finally answered.